For the first time, we will be linking water to all of its various manifestations that contribute to understanding the elements which constitute life as we know it. And these linkages are essential to understand the mechanics by which we will be able to manage water. So let me first of all begin briefly from the global picture of water, and then go to the regional picture, and then come and discuss in greater detail what the water situation in our country stands. Because water is essential for life and civilization, and because its availability is increasingly under threat, we see that the UN, for example, now recommends a much broader collaborative and integrated water management approach that will require many innovations to avoid future conflicts over water among nations and within nations among farmers, urban dwellers, energy producers, environmentalists, and industrialists. Presently, 2 billion people have gained access to improved drinking water since 1990. The MDG goal of halving the number of people without access to improved drinking water, as you know, was achieved ahead of schedule. However, almost 800 million people still do not have access to safe drinking water. Water tables now, not only in Pakistan, but in many parts of the world, are falling. And additional water will be needed for another 2 billion people in just 35 to 40 years. Global water withdrawals have tripled over the last 50 years. By 2030, global water demand could be 40% more than the current supply. Nature also needs sufficient water to be viable to support life. And hence, with this information, we know that business as usual could lead to projected several billion people living in water-stressed areas by 2050. And yet, we know all this could change with new agricultural practices, policy changes, and intelligently applied new technologies, which Abu Bakr is trying to introduce. Agriculture accounts for about 70% of freshwater use, and in our case, it is more than 95%. This could increase to feed growing populations with increasing incomes, and the UN estimates that US $50 to 60 billion annually will be needed between now and 2030 to avoid future water shortages. Some 30% of the global cereal production, for example, could be lost in currently producing regions due to water scarcity. Yet, new areas like in Russia and Canada could open due to climate change. Cooling systems for energy production require large amounts of water, and the distribution of water, of course, at the same time takes a lot of energy too. One of the studies in the US in 2008 showed that nuclear power plants withdrew nearly 8 times more fresh water than natural gas plants for every unit of electricity that is produced. And so, energy demand may increase 40% or more in 20 years. And coupled with the increased food demand, dramatic changes in water management will be required. And that is what I hope this center will be able to do. At the regional level, Asia has 60% of the world's population, but only 28 to 30% of the world's fresh water. China has 8% of the world's water and feeds 22% of the world's population. India has 17% of the world's population and less than 5% of the world's fresh water. Pakistan's case is worse, with much less water and a very rapidly rising population. But I will come to that later. But see what others are doing. China will invest 5.5 billion over 10 years to prevent and treat groundwater contamination. The national water census of that country found that 28,000 rivers have disappeared in China. Now, China plans to quadruple the production of desalinated water by 2020 from 680,000 cubic meters a day as much as 3 million cubic meters. And forced migration due to water shortages has begun in China. In India, it will soon follow, and we are not far behind. The Yangtze, Mekong, and Ganges also are among the most polluted rivers in the world. And see what the others are doing. The government of Victoria in Australia has opened private competition to bid for water supply contracts. China is buying large amounts of agricultural land in Australia to offset carbon. By 2050, an additional 1.5 billion cubic meters of water will be needed in the Middle East, and 2.6 million Afghans, as we know now, are at risk of hunger from drought. And you may have read recently that Yemen may probably be the first capital city to run out of water. And UAE's renewable water resources have decreased 42% in the past 15 years. The economic cost of poor quality of water in countries in the Middle East and North Africa ranges from 0.5% to 2.5% of their GDP. These are all very alarming figures you can see, both at the global level and the national and the regional level. And now I'll say something about what is happening in Pakistan. And I think that will tell us why centers like this that we are inaugurating today have a great need and a great meaning. And therefore, it will need our support. I'll go into greater detail in Pakistan's case because I've been associated with it for a long time. And it's very unfortunate for me to say that today I'm taking support of an economist's view rather than my own background, which is more in engineering. Because I thought maybe decision makers listen to the economists more than they do to engineers. And this view comes from a very eminent economist of Pakistan who was a former finance minister and also has been a financial advisor to the government. And he's held other important positions, and I think also he has lectured at LUMS. And he says that exploiting our geography and demography should be the cornerstone of our future alliances. Market-based economic vision and governance strategies. And he cites the example of Korea, which he says back in the 70s, their economy grew from 8 billion to 15 billion in 2014. And that was a time when the Koreans came to Pakistan to look at our 5-year plans. Pakistan's economy in the same period grew from 10 billion then in 1970 to 250 billion in 2014. And the question he raised is, can we recapture Khalid's vision? Can we build a globally integrated, vibrant market economy that doubles every 10 years? And can we wipe out poverty in our lifetime? Can we get the governance we deserve? And the answer he gives is a cautious yes, but he said, we have to put a game plan in place to achieve this. But what is important is what he said, is that the basis of the game plan lies in recognizing that our economy is basically a water economy. And we had to create economic surpluses from our sustainable endowments. And in our case, these were from land and water. But that did not happen. And the results are reflected in the current state of the economy, where population, as you know, is the 6th largest in the world. Our GDP ranks at 138th in the world. Human Development Index ranks at 146th. Global Competitive Index is 133. World Bank Index of Ease of Doing Business is 122. Economic Freedom Index ranks at 121. And our children rank at the bottom in science and maths. These benchmarks are indicative of our dysfunctional economic and political system. And we have to therefore get our priorities right for economic progress and avert becoming, God forbid, a failed state. And therefore, I will tell you what is happening to our water resources. And even though the story of our water resources management is fairly disappointing. We will look at it in the framework of challenges and opportunities. First of all, as I say, this is really a water economy that we have, and yet there is no approved water policy in the country as yet. And in the wake of climate change and related water management crises which are imminent, this need is absolutely urgent. And I'm not saying that we've done everything on ad hoc basis so far, but it hasn't been optimal. What are the issues? If you look at Pakistan's water resources and look at the institutions that we use to manage our resources, we find that there are too many institutions managing water and too many laws governing it. And yet no single organization is responsible for the integrity of the basin. And when that is the case, no one is responsible. WAPTA was expected to be the custodian of the nation's water resources, but in reality, that never happened due to overlapping roles and responsibilities of several water-related institutions. And also, very sadly, we have missed looking at management of our basin in an integrated manner. Other issues that have affected our water resources and management is increasing population, and more recently, climate change, more frequent extreme events, and declining flows in our western rivers. This is a very alarming thing that is happening and we are noticing now. Low production and productivity of our irrigated agriculture is again a very serious issue which confronts our economy. Disproportionate use of water in agriculture sector. We are using more than 95% of our freshwater resources in agriculture. This is no longer tenable when demands of increasing population, of industry, and of environment are going to be becoming more and more severe and serious. So unless we set our sights on making savings in water use in agriculture sector, we will find ourselves in very difficult conflict situation. Short and narrowly focused private sector engagement. Except for private tube wells, there isn't anything we can show for private sector participation. And of course, economists tell us that we have imperfect marketing and markets. And even more importantly, no firm financing plans at any level for effective management of water resources. Also, ownership issues of land and water have not been resolved and they remain mixed. And look at that, we have a regulator for power, we have no regulator for water use. And then to top it all, we have this big issue of the Indus Waters Treaty. Let's look at what our water resources where do they come from? The main sources of water over the Indus Basin, they come from glaciers and snow, monsoon rains, and groundwater. And this gives you the average water availability in Pakistan from various sources. And you can see that the most important contribution is from our inflows from the rivers, followed by abstraction of groundwater. And then we have rainfall, to which Mr. Lashari was referring earlier this afternoon, and then from outside the basin. But we'll see what is happening to each of these. If you look at where our river water comes from, that comes from Hindu Kush Himalayan region, which are the water towers of Asia, and one of the few and very important water towers of the world. It has the largest reserve of snow and ice outside the polar region. It has 54,000 glaciers spread over 60,000 square kilometers of area and contains more than 6,000 cubic kilometers of ice. And it has approximately 0.76 million square kilometers of snow cover. And it has 10 river basins, 6 are transboundary, including the Indus. And it serves 1.3 billion people. The basin area, of course, earlier it was stated that these figures, which we have taken from ICIMOD's data, is a little less, but the basin area is 1.14 million square kilometers, of which 47% is in Pakistan, 39% is in India, and 6% in Afghanistan. And this river basin is the most glaciated. The Indus River itself has an area of 21,192 square kilometers, where the glaciation is more than 35%. The Indus Basin itself is highly dependent on melting of snow and ice, where already water is very short, 978 cubic meters per person per year, which is even less than 1,000, which is classified as chronically short water supply. And it has a large water-dependent population, 215 million. And it also has the largest irrigation system. Major part of it is in Pakistan, which by itself today is the largest contiguous irrigation system in the world. But it is a supply-driven system and is in need of much better management. What is happening to the glaciers? This is only indicative of just one of the glaciers. There's an anomaly that exists in the glaciers, the Karakoram glaciers. Some of them are receding, and surprisingly, some of them are advancing. But the fact of the matter is that overall, with increasing temperatures, these glaciers are melting. This is a panoramic view of the HKH region. The climate change is having a tremendous effect on this basin. The rising trend in temperatures is now, we can also see increasing extreme weather events, and we've observed decrease in glaciers and snow-covered area. At least for these glaciers, we need to understand climate change in the UIB, Upper Indus Basin. We can do climate monitoring, we can do modeling. We have to better understand the glacier dynamics. We can do that by glacier monitoring, both in situ and remote sensing. We can understand climate change impacts on hydrology, water-related hazards, ecosystems, and livelihoods through impact studies, modeling, and social studies. And fortunately, a lot of these disciplines are going to be available in this center, where we hope some of these problems will get addressed. Rainfall, on the other hand, is scarce. Pakistan is one of the world's most arid countries. Over 75% of its area receives less than 250 millimeters, and 20% of it is less than 125 millimeters. But 14 MAF is the total contribution from rainfall. The population and the economy, therefore, depend on annual inflows into the river, which is about 154.88 million acre-feet of water, mostly derived from snow and glacial melt. In the summer particularly, more than 80% of our water comes from glacial melt. And we haven't quite fully realized the amount of water we are using from our groundwater storage and the important role it is playing in providing water security in Pakistan. The Indus aquifer in the Punjab is underlain to depths of 1,000 feet or more by unconsolidated alluvium, which was saturated to within a few feet of land surface in the 60s. And this is extremely well-suited medium to develop large capacity wells. And groundwater within the depth of 500 feet below the surface averaged less than 1,000 ppm of dissolved solids throughout approximately 2/3 of the Punjab. So it's a great wealth of water resources. Usable groundwater in storage in this part of the alluvial aquifer is approximately 2 billion acre-feet. You can imagine that if you had a storage of 2 billion acre-feet, what kind of resilience it would provide against climate change. In the other 1/3, total dissolved solids range from 1,000 to about 20,000 ppm, and that is a little more difficult to use. And as I said earlier, this groundwater reservoir underlying the Punjab is a very, very valuable resource of enormous economic value. And its scientific management, to my mind, holds one of the important keys to successful irrigated agriculture. And it is a great means for us to protect ourselves from future impacts of climate change. But there are challenges of groundwater management. The nature of occurrence of groundwater in the aquifer is very complex. And I'll show you when we come to the picture, that this complexity with mismanagement has led to serious water quality problems. Second, depletion due to overdraft, and they're leading to quality deterioration. Then we've got, as a consequence, waterlogging and secondary salinization due to poor drainage, unregulated conjunctive use. And as the economists would say, groundwater pricing has been responsible for misuse in many cases and the energy issues that are associated with it. And groundwater governance, you would be surprised that in spite of the role groundwater plays in the agricultural economy of the country, it is not regulated at all. When I told you about the groundwater quality, if you look at these doabs and these red portions at the center of the doabs, these are salt mounds. And when we privatized groundwater development, people obviously developed groundwater in the good water quality areas. And that has led to mixing of salt and fresh water. And wells which were previously giving us good water quality water are now gradually giving us poor quality water. But at that time, people thought that the mixing process was so slow, it was basically molecular diffusion. And I remember back in the 60s, we worked on research at MIT, where we demonstrated that the mixing in porous media really takes place through another process called dispersion, which is thousands of times faster. So when the consultants told us at that time that, no, this is not a very serious issue of mixing, don't worry, it'll take hundreds of years before any substantial mixing takes place, it was wrong. MIT was far advanced of its game at that time. And you can see what has happened. This shows you spatial and temporal groundwater quality maps of the Punjab. And this picture gives you an indication of what is happening to our groundwater levels. Let us now look at the basin with its river system. These are the rivers which irrigated the plains of the Indus Basin. But then, as a result of the Indus Waters Treaty, we had to construct a whole new system in the sense that we had to link and transfer water from one river basin to the other. And we built a very complex but integrated irrigation system, which today is the world's largest contiguous irrigation system in the world. But we must understand the characteristics of flow in our basin. Almost 75 to 80% of the river flows happen to become available in 3 months in the summer. During the rest of the year, it's a trickle. And then the question, of course, that comes to mind is, how can the basin sustain perennial supplies without adequate storage in the system? And of these flows, almost 70 to 80% is from glacial melt. And what is happening to our glaciers? I think these are questions that we need to address. If you come to storages, you can see the per capita storage capacity in different countries is illustrated here. And you can see where Pakistan is. We can't even store more than 30 days of flow in the system, when a good operating system of this size technically requires more than 40% of storage in the system. Ours is even less than 7%. Then we have issues of the Indus Waters Treaty. It was signed in 1960, and it took 10 years to conclude. But let me remind you, the water accord between the provinces took 50 years to conclude. So you can see how difficult these issues are. And I think most of you are familiar that the 3 eastern rivers were given to India, the 3 western rivers came to Pakistan, and all the waters of the eastern rivers were allowed for exclusive use by India. And all the waters of the western rivers, without any restriction, was allowed to Pakistan for its use, except, now this is the most difficult part, except some domestic, agricultural, non-consumptive and hydroelectric uses in India. And this is where now the problem has arisen. The treaty imposes restrictions on agricultural and hydropower generation, which are stipulated in the indexes. And it says that India shall not store any water off or construct any storage on the western rivers. And Article 4 and Annex C, D, and E lists the condition under which India uses from western rivers are to be ensured. India's uses for hydropower was one of the most contentious issues in the negotiations. As in most such cases, it's in the interpretation of the letter and the spirit of the treaty that have raised issues. India is now planning more than 35 dams on Chenab alone. And they are saying these are non-consumptive structures. That means no water will be used from these structures. And we have found that in the filling of Baglayar Dam, for example, just 2 or 3 days of delay in arrival of water at a time when our wheat crop was maturing caused the yield to drop by almost 25 to 30%. These are the various issues under the treaty. And what are the emerging issues and concerns? When we were planning the fourth extension at Tarbela, World Bank did a study, and they found that if you take the last 20 years average of flows into Western rivers, the flows have decreased by almost 10 million acre feet. Now, it's very difficult to exactly say what has caused this. Is it melted glaciers? Is it bad or no watershed management, where in this case all of the watersheds of the Western rivers are in India? Institutional weaknesses, even though they exist on both sides, but there are more so on our side. Groundwater management and its quality has become a big issue for us. Environmental flows, particularly of the three eastern rivers, they don't exist at all. But even on our western rivers, we have to do more work to satisfy everybody, and also good science to see that environmental flows are available. Insufficient technical information and analysis on the likely impacts of growing number of hydroelectric projects proposed by India on western rivers. And as I said, water management of western rivers, and grossly inadequate storage in the system, and deteriorating quality of water coming down natural drainages and the river systems from India. These are issues that require a lot of work, and the Indus Water Commission, which is charged with the responsibility under the treaty, is not adequately equipped to be really satisfactorily pursuing what is our right and defending it properly. And the treaty has no provision for decreasing flows in the system due to climate change, pollution of water from industry, agriculture and deforestation, and watershed management of western rivers, environmental flows of eastern rivers in Pakistan. And most importantly, the treaty doesn't talk anything about groundwater. And more recent information now available from GIS maps prepared by United States agencies show that there is actually flow of water from Pakistan to India. It's a reverse flow against natural gradient. Yet at the same time, I think the treaty has some strengths. It has withstood the test of time, including 3 wars. It has a robust dispute resolution system. The fact that we have a treaty is strength in itself. It has provision for joint development of mutually beneficial projects. But as you know, this cannot happen unless there is trust and good relations exist between the two countries. At this point, any idea of renegotiating the treaty, to my mind at least, is not only dangerous but would be harmful to our interests. And I raise this question because I've been on this track 2 process. Does it help? I think that talking to sensible people in India, we have been able to at least make them realize on 2 or 3 issues that they need to at least understand difficulties and the problems, and one relates to exactly building so many structures, even though they are non-consumptive in nature, how they're going to affect both volume and timing of supplies in our river system. Number 2, the environmental flows in 3 eastern rivers is a major gap which needs to be understood and somehow catered for without reopening the treaty, but adding to it so that we can address this issue. They had begun to realize this in track 2 discussions, of course, after a very long and protracted period of time. I personally think that we need to talk at the professional level and with the opinion makers, and based on good science and sound practices, we need to facilitate a better understanding of the issues and options on both sides. I think that the very large existing financial investments in water and hydropower infrastructure points to the untapped potential both for public and private sectors in water resources development. We haven't leveraged this infrastructure at all in any way to allow public-private partnerships to play its useful role. Besides large infrastructure projects, I also feel that smaller and more micro investments in village ponding structures, micro-level hydel projects, small dams, water harvesting, etc., can address local water shortages and enhance water scrutiny in vulnerable areas of the country, like Gilgit-Baltistan, KPK, Balochistan. But the largest storage deficit in the system will essentially require a major storage, and that we cannot overlook. We have to move away from business as usual. Climate change influences should be recognized and mainstreamed in policy planning and implementation. River basin management approach has to be followed. because this is an integrated basin. What we do at one place immediately has an effect in another place. Benefit sharing, to my mind, in reaching agreements between provinces provides the best hope for legislative and institutional arrangements of the future. My own view is, after my global experience and my experience in this country, that unless we have a mutually agreed benefit sharing system in place, which is negotiated with all the provinces, we will never be able to get an agreement on building a big storage. An arrangement where everybody equally benefits from this intervention in our river system and becomes an equal stakeholder. Fewer and more empowered water management institutions are required, which all stakeholders believe in and will trust. And I think that principle of subsidiarity and stakeholder involvement needs to be followed in water usages. Operation systems in the sector need to be financially feasible, including O&M operations in all subsectors. Irrigated agriculture, the largest user of water, needs to be more efficient. Related policies must provide for incentives for water savings and equitable use of water. And I keep telling our friends everywhere, both in Punjab and Sindh, that in Sindh-Punjab debate, we should be clear that not everyone in Punjab has access of water or even adequate water, and not everyone in Sindh is deprived of water. So there's a sense of mistrust which we need to remove. That will only come when everybody feels that in our water resources management, we are all equal stakeholders. For productivity gains, greater integration of agriculture and water institutions at all levels is needed. This is seriously missing at the moment. Water discourse needs to be redefined with focus on more stakeholder participation at all levels. Water savings is crucial, both in short term and in the long term. If we can set targets, for example, for ourselves, that in the coming 20 years, we will save at least 10% of our water use in agriculture sector, we can meet all of our requirements. But this does not come cheap, and it's not going to come without cost. And that is the kind of commitment that we need to make in our plans. And that is where water policy becomes very important. China, for example, was using more than 80% of their fresh water for agriculture. In the last 30 years, to meet its expanding industrial base, it saved water use in agriculture sector, reduced it from more than 80 to little over 60%. And yet, at the same time, they increased their productivity and production. We have to prevent pollution of our water bodies. We have to look at our salt management in the basin. We have to really look at groundwater use. We are overexploiting, we are mismanaging, and this is a tremendous facility available to us to safeguard ourselves. We do not fully appreciate the fact that if it had not been for this groundwater reservoir, and in the absence of storages, we would not have been able to produce 25 million tons of food grain that we badly need for this country. There's got to be equity in the use of water. IMI's studies in Rachna Doab showed that 70% of the water in a typical distributory in the Punjab is used by 30% of the head-end farmers. And 30% is used by the rest, with the tails in many cases not receiving any water. This kind of distortion in equity leads to serious management issues, both in land use as well as our water resources. We have to vastly improve our service delivery in all aspects of water development and use. Water has to be looked at as a socio-economic and environmental good, and not only as a social good. There was a time, I remember once I was in Egypt, and the Minister of Water Resources in Egypt, Dr. Abu Zaid, which many of you probably would know, asked me to go with his team, who with US aid specialists were negotiating with the farmers to increase water rates. And the people were adamantly against raising water tariffs. And their view was that water is a gift of God, and therefore you can't charge for it. And there was a huge argument on both sides, until one elderly person on their side got up and said, yes, tell me, where has God said that he'll give you water when you want, where you want, of the quality you want, and in the measure you want? If you want that kind of water, it costs. You can get it for once, but you can't get it sustainably. And that is what is happening here. We are not prepared to pay for our even operation and maintenance costs. It's untenable. Good science and sound practices for better water management is a must, and I think this center, hopefully, is going to be addressing that issue. Water institutions of the future, to my mind, will only be viable if they succeed in effectively serving the above mandate. Better water management will bring resilience, and since most manifestations of climate change are reflected in water, improved water management will allow better capacity to absorb climate shocks when they come locally and also nationally. China, for example, their minister was telling me that their policy towards climate change is exactly this. They said climate science is still an evolving science. And for me to totally plan on emerging in a not yet exact science is not very sensible. And I know that the manifestations of climate change in most cases which are going to affect them mostly are in the water. And therefore he said, we want to invest more in water management so that when climate shocks come, we are better prepared to absorb those shocks. I think that Pakistan's economy is basically a water economy. If we manage its water resources well, we will flourish. Otherwise, poverty will remain rampant, and our aspirations for prosperity will languish unendingly. And I keep telling my own friends and colleagues that if you take the case of California, it's a great reminder that when they built the All-American Canal, they started creating economic surpluses which they invested in building infrastructure, which then led to industrialization and the industrial progress that California made. It wasn't the other way around. And I hope that with us recognizing our own endowments of land and water and looking at it as a low-hanging fruit, we would similarly do the same. But it must be reflected in our programs of more investments in this sector. Thank you very much.